the threshold of a nation. The wind off the Delaware Bay in the deep winter of 1787 did not carry the gentle promise of the southern colonies. Nor did it possess the fierce, biting isolation of the far north. It was a damp, heavy cold, the kind that seeped through wool coats and settled deep within the bone. On the evening of December 7th, inside the wood-framed walls of the Golden Fleece Tavern in Dover, the air was thick with a different kind of intensity. Here, the smell of burning oak from the hearth mingled with the sharp scent of hot tallow candles, stale ale, and the damp wool of 30 men who had traveled from every corner of this small, low-lying strip of land. Outside, the darkness of the Delaware Peninsula was vast and quiet. To the casual observer in Philadelphia or London, this small territory, barely 96 miles long and scarcely 30 miles wide at its broadest point, might have seemed insignificant. It was a land of salt marshes, quiet, tidal creeks, and small family farms. It possessed no towering mountain ranges, no vast western frontier, and no sprawling metropolis. Yet, on this particular night, the eyes of a fragile, infant continent were turned toward Dover. For months, the 13 newly independent states of America had existed in a state of dangerous limbo. The war against the British Crown had been won, but the peace was unraveling. The Articles of Confederation, which had bound the states during the rebellion, were proving to be a rope of sand. There was no national currency, no federal court system, and no executive power to enforce the laws. The states were bickering over borders, levying tariffs against one another, and sliding toward financial ruin. In May of that year, a convention of brilliant, anxious minds had gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new charter, a constitution that would forge a single, unified nation out of 13 sovereign republics. But the document they produced was merely a proposal. It was a blueprint written on parchment, meaningless without the consent of the people. For the Constitution to become the law of the land, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it. No state had yet stepped forward. The nation was waiting for someone to take the first, perilous step into the unknown. Inside the Golden Fleece Tavern, the 30 delegates representing the 3 counties of Delaware, Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex sat around heavy wooden tables. They held copies of the proposed Constitution in their hands. They knew the risks. If they approved this document, they would be surrendering a portion of their hard-won sovereignty to a central government. They were a small state, easily overshadowed by the giants of Virginia and Pennsylvania. If the new government became tyrannical, they would have little power to resist. But they also knew the alternative: anarchy, foreign intervention, and the slow death of the American experiment. As the hours wore on, the debates drew to a close. The voices fell silent. The secretary prepared the ledger. One by one, the delegates cast their votes. There was no shouting, no dramatic speeches, only the solemn pronouncement of names and the scratch of a quill pen on paper. When the final tally was made, the result was unanimous. 30 votes in favor, 0 opposed. With that quiet act of courage, Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution of the United States. In doing so, this small, overlooked strip of land did not merely join the Union, it created it. It opened the door through which all others would follow. How did this narrow peninsula, shaped by tide and river, arrive at this moment of supreme destiny? To understand the significance of that cold December night in Dover, one must travel back far beyond the American Revolution. back to a time when the waters of the Delaware ran wild and unnamed. And the destiny of this land was still written in the ancient forests and the shifting sands of the bay. Before Europe arrived, long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, the land we now call Delaware was a place of deep, ancient rhythms. It was a landscape carved by water, bounded on the east by the Atlantic Ocean and the great, shallow expanse of the Delaware Bay, and on the west by the gentle slopes of the Piedmont. For thousands of years, this fertile peninsula was the home of the Lenni Lenape and the Nanticoke peoples. The Lenape, whose name translates to the original people. This land was part of a vast homeland known as Shaiichbi, stretching across the entire Delaware River Valley. They did not view the land as something to be carved up, sold, or subdued. To them, the earth was a living entity, and they were merely its caretakers. The rhythm of Lenape life was dictated by the seasons. In the spring, when the ice melted and the rivers ran high, they gathered along the banks of the river. They called the Lenapewihituk the River of the Lenape, which we now know as the Delaware River. Here, they built seasonal villages of wigwams, constructed from bent saplings and covered with sheets of birch bark or woven reed mats. The river was their highway, their source of life, and their protector. In the spring, the waters would boil with life as millions of shad, sturgeon, and herring migrated upstream to spawn. Using woven nets, stone-tipped spears, and large wooden traps, the Lenape harvested the bounty of the waters. They collected oysters and clams from the shallow bays, preserving them by smoking the meat over slow fires for the winter months ahead. As the heat of summer arrived, the women of the villages turned their attention to the rich, alluvial soil of the riverbanks. With tools made of deer bone and wood, they planted fields of the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash. These crops grew in a beautiful, symbiotic harmony. The corn stalks provided a natural trellis for the climbing beans, while the broad leaves of the squash shaded the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds from taking root. In the autumn, as the leaves of the oak, hickory, and chestnut trees turned to brilliant shades of gold and amber, the Lenape moved inland into the dense forests. The men, skilled with bows made of hickory and arrows tipped with quartz or jasper, hunted white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, and elk. The meat was dried for winter, while the hides were carefully tanned using deer brains to create soft, durable clothing, moccasins, and winter robes. Further south, along the rivers and salt marshes that drained into the Chesapeake and Delaware bays, lived the Nanticoke, the Tidewater people. They were master canoe builders, carving sleek, swift vessels from the trunks of massive bald cypress trees using fire and stone adzes. The Nanticoke were famous for their skill in navigating the labyrinth of marshes, creeks, and rivers. They were also renowned traders, exchanging highly prized wampum beads fashioned from the purple and white shells of the quahog clam with tribes far into the interior of the continent. For generations, the Lenape and the Nanticoke lived in a world where the boundary between humanity and nature was thin. Their stories and legends spoke of a world populated by spirits, the spirit of the corn, the spirit of the wind, the spirit of the great sturgeon. They understood that their survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance with the natural world, taking only what they needed and offering gratitude for the gifts of the earth. The forests were ancient and thick, dominated by giants that had stood for centuries. The air was clean. The waters of the bay were clear. And the silence of the peninsula was broken only by the call of the osprey, the rustle of the wind through the salt marsh grass, and the gentle lap of the tide. It was a world of timeless continuity. But far to the east, across the gray, turbulent waters of the Atlantic, a restless, hungry civilization was beginning to look outward. The ancient peace of the Delaware Peninsula was about to be shattered forever. The first Europeans, in the late summer of 1609, a strange vessel appeared off the coast of the Delaware Peninsula. It was a small, high-stern ship of 80 tons, its wooden hull dark with pitch, its sails stained by the salt spray of the North Atlantic. On its transom was painted its name, the Halve Main, the Half Moon. Commanding this vessel was Henry Hudson, an English navigator of formidable reputation, hired by the Dutch East India Company. Hudson was not seeking a new land to colonize, nor was he interested in the pristine beauty of the American wilderness. He was a man possessed by a single, driving obsession: finding the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the American continent that would offer European merchants a direct, lucrative path to the spice-rich markets of Asia. On August 28, 1898, Hudson steered the Half Moon into the mouth of a vast, uncharted bay. As the ship glided into the shallow waters, Hudson and his crew looked out upon a low, green coastline. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But their initial hope quickly turned to frustration. The bay was treacherously shallow, filled with shifting sandbars and hidden shoals that threatened to ground their vessel. Hudson sent men in a small boat to sound the depths. But they found only dangerous, turbulent waters and a current that suggested they were entering the mouth of a large river, not an open sea passage to China. Realizing that this was not the route to Asia, Hudson turned the Half Moon back to the open ocean, sailing north toward the river that would eventually bear his name. Though Hudson spent only a single day in the bay, his brief visit had redrawn the maps of Europe. He had claimed this vast estuary for the Dutch Republic, naming it the South River to distinguish it from the North River, which was the Hudson. A year later, in 1610, an English captain named Samuel Argall, commanding the vessel Discovery, was blown off course by a violent summer storm while sailing toward the young colony of Virginia. Argall sought shelter in the same wide bay that Hudson had visited. He did not land, nor did he explore its depths, but he noted its position on his charts. In an effort to curry favor with the governor of Virginia, Thomas West, the third Baron Delaware, Argall named the northern point of the bay Cape Delaware. Over time, this name, anglicized and softened by the tongues of generations of sailors, would expand to encompass the bay, the great river that fed it, the indigenous people who lived along its banks, and, eventually, the state itself, Delaware. For the next 2 decades, the Delaware Bay remained a quiet frontier, visited only by Dutch fur traders who bartered with the Lenape for valuable beaver pelts. The traders sailed up the river, established temporary posts, and departed, leaving the land largely as they found it. But the reports they brought back to Europe spoke of a fertile land, rich in timber, fish, and fur, with soil that promised abundant harvests. To the crowded, war-weary nations of Europe, this empty coastline was a blank canvas upon which they could paint their imperial ambitions. The era of exploration was drawing to a close. The era of colonization, with all its hope, greed, and tragedy was about to begin. The Dutch settlement in the spring of 1631. The quiet waters of Cape Henlopen, near the southern mouth of the Delaware Bay, witnessed the arrival of 32 Dutch colonizers. They had been sent by the Dutch West India Company, under the leadership of a wealthy patron named David Peterson de Vries. Their mission was to establish a permanent colony named Zwanendale, the Valley of the Swans. It was an ambitious and highly specialized venture. The Dutch did not merely wish to trade for furs. They intended to build a whaling station and agricultural settlement. The waters of the Delaware Bay were known to be frequented by right whales, and the oil extracted from their blubber was one of the most valuable commodities in Europe. Used for lighting lamps and making soap, the colonists chose a site along a quiet creek, just inland from the bay, near the modern-day town of Lowes. They set to work with energy and hope. They cleared the land, built a substantial brick and timber house surrounded by a strong wooden palisade, and planted crops of wheat and corn. They set up vats for rendering whale oil and prepared their boats for the spring whaling season. To mark their possession of the land and to establish the authority of the Dutch Republic, the colony's commander, Gilles Hosset, erected a wooden post near the settlement. To this post, he affixed a shining piece of tin sheet metal, upon which was painted the coat of arms of the States General of the Netherlands. For a brief moment, Zwanendale was a picture of European industriousness on the edge of the wild. But this small island of Dutch civilization was surrounded by a vast, sovereign indigenous world. The Lenape watched this sudden intrusion with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and caution. The tragedy that followed was not born of premeditated malice, but of a profound and tragic misunderstanding between two cultures that did not speak the same language of ownership and respect. One day, a Lenape chief, visiting the area near the settlement, saw the glittering piece of tin bearing the Dutch coat of arms. To the Lenape, who did not understand the European concept of state sovereignty or heraldry, the shiny metal appeared to be a highly valuable material, perfect for fashioning into tobacco pipes. The chief, seeing no practical use for the post other than as a display, took the tin plate and went his way. When Gilles Hosset discovered that the coat of arms had been taken, he reacted with disproportionate anger. To the Dutch, the defacement of the national symbol was an act of treason, a direct insult to the honor of the Dutch Republic and the West India Company. He demanded that the perpetrators be identified and punished. The Lenape, anxious to maintain peace and trade relations with these well-armed strangers, took the Dutch anger to heart. Fearing that a war would erupt, a group of Lenape warriors went into the forest, located the chief who had taken the tin, and, in accordance with their own laws of justice, executed him. They returned to Zwanendale and presented the Dutch with proof of the chief's death. Hosset was horrified. He had not desired the death of the chief. He had merely wanted the return of the tin and an apology. He tried to explain this to the Lenape, but the damage was done. The relatives of the slain chief were consumed by a desire for vengeance. To them, the Dutch were directly responsible for the death of their kinsman. They waited for the right moment, watching the rhythms of the colony. In the late autumn of 1631, when most of the Dutchmen were working in the fields, far from their weapons, a group of Lenape approached the settlement under the pretense of trading beaver pelts. Only a few men, including Gilles Hosset and a sick colonist, remained inside the palisade, along with a large mastiff dog that guarded the entrance. The Lenape entered the house. At a prearranged signal, they struck. Hasset and the sick man were killed instantly. The mastiff, who could have defended them, was shot repeatedly with arrows. The warriors then swept out into the fields. The unsuspecting Dutch farmers, working without their muskets, had no chance. One by one, they were cut down where they stood. The Lenape set fire to the crops, dismantled the buildings, and left the settlement in ruins. A year later, in December 1632, David de Vries sailed into the bay, eager to see the progress of his colony. As his ship anchored in the creek, he was met by a profound, eerie silence. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No voices hailed him from the shore. De Vries stepped onto the land and walked toward the ruins of Zwanendale. He found the charred remains of the palisade, the broken bricks of the chimney, and the skulls and bones of his 32 countrymen scattered across the grass, gnawed by wolves and bleached by the sun. It was a grim, haunting testament to the fragility of European ambition in this new world. The Dutch had sought to conquer the Valley of the Swans, but the wilderness had reclaimed its own. De Vries realized that the colony was a total loss. He made a fragile peace with the Lenape, gathered what little remained of his equipment, and sailed away. The first European settlement in Delaware had ended in blood and ashes. But the story of Delaware was not destined to end in the silence of Zwanendale. Other eyes, far across the sea, were already looking toward the blue waters of the Delaware River. New Sweden, in the spring of 1638. Two Swedish ships, the Kalmar Nickel Key of Kalmar and the Fogel Grip Griffin, sailed up the Delaware River. Unlike the commercial Dutch whalers, these ships carried families, soldiers, and tools. They were the vanguard of the Kingdom of Sweden, then a great military power in Europe under the influence of the late King Gustavus Adolphus and his brilliant chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. The Swedes wished to establish a global empire, and they had hired a man who knew the Delaware River better than almost any other European, Peter Minuit. Minuit was a veteran colonial administrator. He had once been the Director General of New Amsterdam for the Dutch, famous for his purchase of Manhattan Island. Having fallen out of favor with his Dutch employers, Minuit offered his services to the Swedish crown, promising to lead them to a fertile, unclaimed territory where they could build a colony to rival New Netherland. Minuit knew that while the Dutch claimed the entire Delaware River Valley, they had no physical presence there since the destruction of Zwanendale. He steered the Swedish ships into a tributary of the Delaware, which he named the Christina River in honor of the young, 12-year-old Queen of Sweden. On a natural wharf of Roxasite, located within the modern city limits of Wilmington, Peter, Minuit stepped ashore. He did not repeat the mistakes of the Dutch. He immediately summoned the local Lenape chiefs to a council. On the deck of the Kalmar Nickel, Minuit negotiated a treaty in exchange for kettles, blankets, axes, and mirrors. The Lenape sold the Swedes a strip of land running along the west side of the Delaware River, from Cape Henlopen north to the Schuylkill River. With the land secured, the Swedes set to work building Fort Christina. It was a modest, star-shaped structure of earth and timber, armed with several small cannons. Inside, they built log houses, a storehouse, and a chapel. This was the birth of New Sweden, Nya Sverige. For the next 17 years, this tiny Nordic outpost clung to the banks of the Delaware. The settlers who arrived on subsequent voyages were a diverse group: Swedes, Finns, and Germans. Many of the Finns were skilled foresters from the border regions of Sweden and Finland, accustomed to clearing dense forests and living in harsh climates. It was these Finnish and Swedish settlers who introduced an architectural innovation to the American continent that would become an iconic symbol of the American frontier, the log cabin. Using only a simple iron axe, a skilled Finnish woodsman could fell a tree, notch the ends of the logs so they fit together snugly at the corners, and construct a warm, draft-free home in a matter of days. Unlike the drafty frame houses of the English or the brick structures of the Dutch, the log cabin was perfectly suited to the heavily forested, cold American landscape. It required no nails, no mortar, and no specialized tools. It was a brilliant adaptation to the wilderness. Born in the forests of Scandinavia and planted in the soil of Delaware, under the energetic governance of Johann Prince, a mountain of a man who weighed over 400 pounds and was known to the Lenape as Big Tub, New Sweden expanded. Prince established his capital further up the river at Tinicum Island, built forts to control river traffic, and established a thriving trade in beaver pelts and tobacco. The Swedes and Finns lived in remarkable harmony with the Lenape. Unlike other European colonizers who sought to subjugate or convert the indigenous population by force, the Swedes treated the Lenape as trading partners and neighbors. They learned the Lenape language, traded fairly, and avoided the bloody conflicts that plagued the English in Virginia and the Dutch in New Amsterdam. Yet, New Sweden was a fragile dream. The homeland was far away, distracted by the devastating conflicts of the 30 Years' War in Europe. Supply ships arrived infrequently, sometimes leaving the colonists for years without gunpowder, clothing, or manufactured goods. They survived only through their own resourcefulness and the generosity of their Lenape neighbors. In the quiet, mist-shrouded mornings along the Christina River, the Swedish and Finnish settlers cleared fields, planted rye and barley, and watched their children grow in this vast, strange land. They had built a piece of Scandinavia in the American wilderness, a place of peace and industry. But their presence had not gone unnoticed. To the north, in New Amsterdam, the Dutch were watching the growth of New Sweden with growing anger. They still claimed the Delaware River as their own, and they were preparing to reclaim it by force of arms. Dutch and English control. In late August 1655, a formidable fleet of 7 Dutch war vessels, carrying over 300 soldiers, sailed into the Delaware River. Commanding this armada was Peter Stuyvesant, the iron-willed, peg-legged Director General of New Netherland. Stuyvesant was a man who brooked no competition. The Dutch West India Company had ordered him to put an end to the Swedish presence on the river once and for all. Against this overwhelming force, the Swedes had almost no defense. Fort Christina was defended by only a handful of sick and poorly supplied soldiers. The Swedish governor, Johann Rising, realized that resistance was futile. To engage in battle would mean the senseless slaughter of his people. On September 15, Fort Christina surrendered without a single drop of blood being spilled. Under the terms of the capitulation, the Swedish settlers were allowed to remain on their lands, preserve their language, practice their Lutheran religion, and retain their properties. New Sweden, as a political entity, had vanished from the map, absorbed into the global empire of the Dutch Republic. For the next 9 years, the Dutch ruled the Delaware region, renaming Fort Christina to Altena and establishing a bustling capital at New Amstel, which is today the historic city of Newcastle. New Amstel became a melting pot of cultures. Dutch merchants, Swedish farmers, Finnish woodsmen, English refugees from Virginia and enslaved Africans lived and worked side by side. It was a vibrant, commercial hub, but its existence was destined to be short-lived. The great geopolitical chess match of the 17th century was playing out across the Atlantic, and the ultimate victor was about to claim the prize. In 1664, King Charles II of England decided to assert the English claim to the entire Atlantic coast of North America. Ignoring the claims of the Dutch, he granted a vast territory, including all of New Netherland and the Delaware region, to his brother, James, the Duke of York. To enforce this claim, an English fleet sailed into New York Harbor in August 1664. Peter Stuyvesant, facing a hostile population and overwhelming force, surrendered New Amsterdam without a fight to secure the Delaware region. The Duke of York dispatched Sir Robert Carr with a small fleet. Unlike New Amsterdam, the Dutch commander at New Amstel, Alexander de Noyassa, refused to surrender. In October 1664, the English stormed the fort at New Amstel. It was a short, violent clash. The English soldiers plundered the town, confiscated the property of the Dutch merchants, and sold many of the Dutch soldiers into servitude in Virginia. New Amstel was renamed Newcastle, and the English flag was raised over the banks of the Delaware. In the span of just over 30 years, the people of Delaware had lived under 4 different flags first: the sovereign nations of the Lenape and Nanticoke, then the blue and yellow of Sweden, the orange, white, and blue of the Dutch Republic, and, finally, the Red Cross of St. George of England. Each wave of colonization left its mark upon the soil and the culture of the region. The Swedes gave the land its first permanent homes, the Dutch gave it its early commercial character, and the English brought their language, their common law, and their system of government. In 1682, the destiny of Delaware took another dramatic turn. William Penn, a wealthy English Quaker who had been granted the vast province of Pennsylvania by King Charles II, realized that his landlocked colony needed access to the ocean to survive. Without control of the Delaware River and Bay, Pennsylvania's commerce could be strangled at any moment by a hostile power. Penn petitioned the king, and in August 1682, the Duke of York leased the 3 lower counties on the Delaware and Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex to William Penn. When Penn stepped ashore at Newcastle in October of that year, he was presented with a traditional European ceremony of possession, the livery of Sison. The town leaders handed Penn a sod of earth, a bowl of water, and the key to the fort, symbolizing his ownership of the land, the water, and the people. But the people of the 3 lower counties were not entirely pleased with this arrangement. They were a diverse, independent-minded population of Swedes, Finns, Dutch, and early English settlers. They had little in common with the English Quakers who were flooding into Philadelphia. They feared that their interests would be ignored by the larger, more populous Pennsylvania Assembly. For 20 years, the representatives of Delaware bickered with the Pennsylvania legislature, demanding equal representation and protection for their trade. Finally, in 1704, William Penn conceded to their demands. He granted the 3 lower counties permission to form their own independent legislature, which met for the first time in Newcastle, though they shared the same governor as Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. The people of Delaware now possessed their own laws, their own identity, and their own destiny. They were a distinct, self-governing community, small but fiercely protective of their independence. As the mid-18th century approached, the colonies were growing restless under the rule of the British Crown. The small, independent spirit of Delaware was about to be tested in the crucible of a global revolution. Delaware and the American Revolution. The decade of the 1770s brought a dark, electric tension to the 13 American colonies. In Delaware, as elsewhere, the heavy-handed policies of King George III and the British Parliament, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act were met with fierce resistance. The people of Delaware, accustomed to governing themselves through their own assembly, viewed these taxes without representation as a direct assault on their liberty. Yet, Delaware was a deeply divided land. In the northern county of Newcastle, where the economy was tied to shipping, milling, and trade with Philadelphia, the spirit of rebellion ran hot. The merchants and lawyers of Newcastle were eager to stand with the Continental cause. But in the southern counties of Kent and Sussex, the population was more conservative, rural, and isolated. Many of the farmers were loyal to the king, or simply wished to be left in peace, fearing that a war with the greatest military power on earth would bring ruin to their quiet lives. Despite these divisions, when the call to arms came, Delaware answered. In June 1776, as the Continental Congress in Philadelphia debated the historic question of independence, the Delaware Assembly met at the courthouse in Newcastle. On June 15, they took a bold, treasonous step. They voted to sever all ties with the British Crown and declare Delaware a free and independent state. This date is still celebrated as Delaware Separation Day, the moment Delaware officially declared its own independence, not just from Great Britain, but from Pennsylvania as well. But the path to national independence was fraught with peril. In late June, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia prepared to vote on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, to present a unified front to the world. The vote had to be unanimous among the 13 colonies. Delaware's delegation to the Congress consisted of 3 men: Thomas McKean, George Read, and Caesar Rodney. On July 1st, as the preliminary vote was taken, the Delaware delegation was deadlocked. Thomas McKean, a fiery advocate for independence, voted yes. George Read, a cautious lawyer who feared that the colonies were not yet ready for war, voted no. Caesar Rodney, the third delegate, was not in Philadelphia. He was 80 miles away, at his home near Dover, trying to quiet a loyalist uprising in the southern counties. McKean, realizing that a divided Delaware vote would ruin the chances of a unanimous declaration, sent an urgent express rider into the stormy night to summon Rodney. On the morning of July 2nd, Caesar Rodney received the message. He was a man of 47, suffering from severe asthma and a painful skin cancer that disfigured his face, forcing him to wear a green silk veil. Despite his physical suffering, Rodney did not hesitate. He mounted his horse and set off for Philadelphia. It was a ride that would secure his place in the pantheon of American heroes. Rodney rode through the heat of the day and into a violent summer thunderstorm. The roads were turned to deep, thick mud. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against his face. He changed horses at post stations along the way, pressing on through the darkness of the night, driven by a single, desperate purpose. On the afternoon of July 2nd, as the delegates gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, Caesar Rodney, covered in mud, his clothes soaked, his boots caked with clay, walked into the assembly room. When the vote for Delaware was called, Rodney rose to his feet. "I believe the voice of my constituents and of all sensible and honest men is in favor of independence," Rodney declared, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "My own judgment concurs with them. I, therefore, vote for independence." With those words, Delaware's vote was cast in the affirmative. The deadlock was broken. The colonies stood as one. 2 days later, on July 4th, 1870, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted. But declaring independence was one thing, winning it was another. During the long, bloody years of the Revolutionary War, Delaware, despite its small size, made contributions that far outweighed its population. The state raised a regiment of remarkable soldiers, the Delaware Regiment, often called the Delaware Line, under the command of Colonel John Haslett. These men became famous throughout the Continental Army for their discipline, their bravery, and their striking uniforms, blue coats lined with red, with high, brass-fronted caps. The regiment earned the nickname the Blue Hens Chicks. According to legend, the soldiers carried with them gamecocks bred from a famous Delaware blue hen, renowned for their fierce, indomitable fighting spirit. In battle, the men of the Delaware Line fought with the same relentless courage, earning the respect of General George Washington himself. At the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, when the American army was surrounded and facing total destruction by the British, the Delaware Regiment, alongside the Maryland Line, held the line against overwhelming odds, allowing the rest of Washington's army to escape across the East River. They stood firm in the face of British bayonet charges, retreating only when ordered, and carrying their wounded with them. The Delaware Line fought in nearly every major campaign of the war, from the cold victories at Trenton and Princeton to the desperate defense of their own soil at the Battle of Couch's Bridge, the only battle of the Revolution fought on Delaware soil, to the brutal Southern campaigns at Camden, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse. By the end of the war, the Delaware Regiment had been decimated by casualties and disease. Of the hundreds of men who had marched out of Wilmington in 1776, only a fraction returned. They had sacrificed their blood and their lives on battlefields hundreds of miles from home, bound by a belief in a free and united America. When the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the victory belonged to the small state as much as the large ones. But the end of the war brought a new, equally difficult challenge: how to govern this new, fragile republic. The first state. In the hot summer of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Their task was to repair the failing Articles of Confederation. But they quickly realized that they had to build something entirely new. Representing Delaware at this historic constitutional convention was a group of brilliant, experienced men: John Dickinson, Gunning Bedford Jr., George Reed, Richard Bassett, and Jacob Broome. As the convention progressed, a fierce debate erupted that threatened to tear the young nation apart before it could be born. The division was between the large, populous states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, and the small states, like Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The large states proposed the Virginia Plan, which argued that representation in the new federal Congress should be based on population. To Delaware, this was an existential threat. If representation were based solely on population, the large states would dominate the federal government, leaving the small states powerless to protect their own commerce, borders, and rights. Gunning Bedford Jr., A stout, hot-tempered delegate from Wilmington rose to address the convention. His voice rang out with passion and a stark warning to the representatives of the larger states. "I do not trust you, gentlemen," Bedford declared. "If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be improper, and what would prevent you from exercising it to our destruction?" He went so far as to suggest that if the small states were not treated fairly, they might seek foreign alliances to protect themselves from their larger neighbors. The convention was on the brink of collapse. It was John Dickinson, the respected elder statesman of Delaware, a man who had written the famous letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania and had served as president of both Delaware and Pennsylvania, who helped guide the delegates toward a solution. Dickinson, along with other small state delegates, proposed a compromise, a bicameral legislature. In one house, the House of Representatives' representation would be based on population, satisfying the large states, but in the other, the Senate, every state, regardless of its size, wealth, or population, would have equal representation. 2 senators for Delaware, 2 for Virginia, 2 for Pennsylvania. This historic agreement, known as the Great Compromise, was the key that unlocked the Constitution. It preserved the dignity and power of the small states, ensuring that they would always have an equal voice in the councils of the nation. With this crucial compromise secured, the Delaware delegation signed the finished Constitution on September 17. Now, the battle shifted to ratification. In Delaware, there was little of the bitter, protracted debate that characterized other states. The people of Delaware recognized that the proposed Constitution, with its equal representation in the Senate, was a magnificent triumph for them. It offered them the protection of a strong federal union while preserving their sovereign voice. On November 26, elections were held across Delaware to select 30 delegates to a state convention. The delegates gathered on December 3rd at the Golden Fleece Tavern in Dover. For 4 days, they read the document, discussed its provisions, and pondered the future. The atmosphere was quiet, businesslike, and determined. There were no riots in the streets, no pamphlets filled with vitriol, only a shared understanding that this was Delaware's moment to lead. On the afternoon of December 7th, the 30 delegates signed the document of ratification. With that act of unanimous consent, Delaware took its place at the head of the American column. It was a moment of supreme historical irony. The state that had been the smallest, the most vulnerable, and the most fiercely protective of its autonomy was the first to surrender a portion of that autonomy to create a new, grand federal republic. By ratifying the Constitution first, Delaware did not merely join the United States, it led the way. It set a precedent of courage and faith in the future, proving that size is not the measure of greatness. The news of Delaware's ratification spread across the country, inspiring supporters of the Constitution in other states to redouble their efforts. Within days, Pennsylvania followed, then New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. The chain had begun, and the first link had been forged in Dover, Delaware today. If the ghosts of Peter Minuit, Johann Prince, Caesar Rodney, and John Dickinson were to walk the land of Delaware today, they would find a landscape that has changed beyond all recognition, yet one that still preserves the quiet, resilient character they helped to forge. Today, Delaware is home to more than 1 million people. It remains the second smallest state in the Union by land area, larger only than Rhode Island, and it ranks 45th in population. Yet, its influence on the modern global economy is immense, far outweighing its geographic footprint. At the center of the state lies Dover, the quiet, historic capital. At the heart of Dover is the Green, a grassy square laid out in 1,717 inches, accordance with the orders of William Penn. It was here, in the taverns and public buildings that surrounded this quiet square, that the delegates met to ratify the Constitution in 1787. Today, surrounded by mature elm trees and historic brick buildings, the Green remains a place of quiet reflection, a physical link to the moment of the state's birth. To the north, where the rolling hills of the Piedmont meet the Delaware River, lies Wilmington, the state's largest city. Wilmington is a bustling center of commerce and industry, built on the very site where Peter Minuit's Swedish settlers stepped ashore at the rocks in 1638. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the city became an industrial powerhouse, famous for its shipyards, its leather tanneries, and, above all, the chemical empire founded by the DuPont family E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, which transformed Wilmington into the chemical capital of the world. But Delaware's most unique modern distinction lies not in factories or farms, but in its laws. Thanks to the pioneering General Corporation law enacted in the early 20th century and the highly respected Delaware Court of Chancery, a specialized court that resolves complex business disputes with unparalleled expertise, Delaware has become the legal home of American capitalism. Today, more than 1 million business entities are incorporated in Delaware. This includes over 60% of the Fortune 500 companies and thousands of global corporations, though their corporate headquarters may be located in New York, San Francisco, or Chicago. Their legal identity is rooted in the soil of Delaware. The state offers a stable, predictable, and sophisticated legal environment that has made it the corporate registry capital of the world. And yet, despite this global financial significance, Delaware remains a place of remarkable natural beauty and quiet charm. To the south, beyond the bustling highway corridors, lies a landscape of agricultural richness and coastal serenity. Here, fields of corn and soybeans stretch to the horizon, reminding visitors of the ancient agricultural traditions of the Lenape and the early Swedish and English farmers. Along the eastern edge of the peninsula, where the Delaware Bay meets the Atlantic Ocean, lie the coastal towns of Lewis, Rehoboth Beach, and Bethany Beach. In Lewis, near the site of the tragic Dutch settlement of Zwanendale, historic clapboard houses stand along quiet, tree-lined streets. At Cape Henlopen State Park, where Henry Hudson once anchored the Half Moon, massive sand dunes shift with the wind, and wild pine forests stand sentinel over the ocean waves. It is a land where the modern and the ancient exist in a quiet, harmonious tension, the global corporate registry, and the quiet coastal marsh, the bustling chemical laboratory and the historic agricultural field, the vibrant diversity of a modern immigrant population, and the deep, enduring heritage of the first state. Small in size, first in destiny, history is not merely a collection of dates, names, and treaties written on yellowed parchment. It is a living, breathing stream, carved by the courage, the sacrifices, and the quiet decisions of those who came before. Delaware's story is a testament to the power of the small. From its very beginnings, this narrow strip of land was a place of encounters, a crossroads where different worlds met, clashed, and ultimately fused into something new. It was a land where the ancient, sustainable wisdom of the Lenape and Nanticoke met the restless, pioneering energy of Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and England. It was a land that saw the bloody tragedy of Zwannendale, the peaceful industry of New Sweden's log cabins, and the diverse commercial bustle of Dutch New Amstel and English Newcastle. It was a land that, when the storm of revolution broke over the colonies, gave the nation the desperate midnight ride of Caesar, Rodney, and the fierce, unbreakable spirit of the Delaware Regiment. And, on that cold, historic night of December 7th, 1887, in the warm, candlelit rooms of the Golden Fleece Tavern in Dover. It was this small, independent-minded community that had the vision and the courage to take the first step. They did not wait to see what Virginia would do. They did not wait to see how the great state of New York would vote. They did not let their small size make them timid. They stood up, cast their votes, and signed their names to a new vision of human liberty. By becoming the first state to ratify the Constitution of the United States, Delaware did not just join a union of states. It gave that union its first breath of legal life. It set the course for a nation that would eventually stretch from ocean to ocean, home to hundreds of millions of people, all living under the protection of the document that Delaware was the first to embrace. Delaware is not the largest state in the Union. It is not the most populous, nor is it the most powerful, but in the great, unfolding drama of America, Delaware holds a place that can never be taken away. It was the beginning. It was the anchor. It was the spark. From the quiet waters of the Christina River to the busy streets of Wilmington, from the historic green of Dover to the wind-swept dunes of Cape Henlopen, the legacy of that historic choice still lives on. Delaware was small in size, but first in destiny. It was, and remains, the first state